carbon markets are not a silver bullet, but they can play a very important contribution alongside a lot of other sources of financing in least developed countries to move towards sustainable, more industrialized agriculture that can improve food production, but improve livelihoods as well.
Hello, this is the weekly Tradecast, a podcast brought to you by UNCTAD and Development. I'm Sarah Toms. We're exploring how major events are shaping trade and development and how that affects billions of people around the world. This week we're looking at carbon markets and how they can help the most vulnerable countries address inequalities and also help us protect the planet. Least developed countries, or LDCs for short, suffer much of the human and economic toll of climate change, even though they do little damage themselves. To help them, the UN's latest Least Developed Countries report looks at how the trading of carbon to mitigate climate change can also open up extra funds for development. Carbon trading seeks to limit emissions by allowing production in one place, such as a factory, to be offset against reductions in another place. But critics say carbon trading gives rich countries a license to pollute, and that many developing countries see few benefits. So how can carbon trading help support sustainable growth? Well, here now for more on the report and the opportunities for LDCs are two guests. Paul Akiwumi is Director of the Africa Least Developed Countries and Special Programs Division at UNCTAD and Development, and he's responsible for the report. Also joining me is Jean-Paul Adam, Director of Policy, Monitoring and Advocacy at the United Nations Office of the Special Advisor on Africa. Before that, Jean-Paul was a government minister in his native Seychelles. So welcome to you both. It's great to have you here today. Now, before we get to the report, let's get some context from you, Jean-Paul, about carbon trading, because it's not new, is it? But it's still not a common term for everyone. So could you give us an overview of how carbon markets work, and are they a good solution to mitigating climate change or just a license to pollute?
Carbon trading is based on the principle that we do need to reduce the overall carbon emissions globally. And it recognizes that the way in which these emissions will be reduced may differ by sector, and they may differ by levels of development. And essentially, it's a market-based mechanism that therefore allows those sectors or those regions that need more time, meaning that they will need to continue pursuing polluting activities for a period, to be able to do so while offsetting through activities that actually contribute positively. And there is nothing intrinsically wrong with this. In fact, it is a potentially powerful development tool. The risk that is associated, which you have mentioned as is it a license to pollute, is the capacity for countries, for organizations, for the United Nations and for all partners to be able to say with certainty that this represents a positive offset, meaning that there is a benefit in terms of reducing carbon, but there is also a benefit in terms of the development trajectory. There are good examples and there are bad examples. And I think the focus really must be, if we look at the development aspect, we all recognize that now successful sustainable development cannot actually be divorced from low carbon development. So I would say that this is one of the most critical tools, if done right, to actually accelerate the achievement of the sustainable development goals and also the goals of the Paris Agreement.
That's the crux, isn't it? Doing it right. So, Paul, the new report says there's great potential, as we've discussed, for least developed countries to benefit from carbon trading. But what are your findings, and how big a difference could it make for LDCs?
Thank you, Sarah. This report is, in fact, we're celebrating its 40th anniversary because UNCTAD has been undertaking this report for 40 years. So it's a great milestone for us. Paul just mentioned about this tool, which we all believe is a very positive tool. But we have to look at it through the lens of LDCs, how they're utilizing it and whether it is making a difference for that development and providing them with the essential additional financing they need. Well, what we see from this report is that out of the 46 LDCs Essentially, 6 LDCs are using this mechanism. Now, it requires, of course, a lot of institutional capacity. It requires monetary frameworks. It requires verification frameworks that these countries have to put in place, and national and regulatory frameworks as well. But what we are seeing from this report is that although it is providing some input, financial input, to support the countries in climate financing, it should not be considered as a silver bullet for climate financing. What we have seen over the years we've studied this is that essentially when you look at this report, there's 6 countries that have been using carbon credits, selling carbon credits. That's approximately $400 million they've brought in compared to $31 billion from FDI and compared to $66 billion from remittances. So it is really very much a drop in the ocean, but it's a drop in the right direction.
But what are the challenges for more LDCs to join the carbon markets and generally the challenges within carbon trading?
I think for LDCs, one of the biggest challenges is linked to development. One has to recognize that when you sell your carbon credits, you are retiring a forest, for example, for 30 years. In essence, you can equate it to having a fixed rate sale of your minerals for over 40 years. So you are losing the opportunity, for example, if it's a forest, you're losing the opportunity to use that forest to develop further. That is an important aspect about it, that you don't retire your assets and not consider them whether they can be used for sustainable development in other areas. The second thing is that you are losing your ability to also have quick wins. Generally, out of the 400 million I mentioned, most of it, if not all, is sold to external partners. And the third thing is that there is no legislative framework for the equitable share of these profits. So although I mentioned 400 million, we are not even sure whether the country is even getting 400 million because there's so many intermediaries, there's so many brokers, there are all sorts of things in between. So I think these are fundamental things that LDCs have to be aware of. And in the same moment, they need to recognize that they need to put the right institutional frameworks in place and the right monitoring frameworks in place. And this is a costly, of course, exercise. And they should try and consider whether they should regionalize these things and do it a regional inventory rather than all national inventories. It must be linked to their development aspirations and plans.
Jean-Paul, I want to ask you, how can LDCs use these carbon markets to perhaps shape broader solutions around the climate change and development and investment from your perspective?
One of the challenges is that the majority of current carbon market operations are in the voluntary carbon market, which means you will essentially have a company, a large corporation, that is looking to offset. So essentially the demand for the service is being driven by a demand for offsetting. So they're looking for this license to pollute, to put it another way. And because they are the ones looking for an opportunity, the risk is that they are trying to find the project which is the simplest for them to do from a practical perspective and which has the least cost for their perspective. And the opportunity for least developed countries is to define it on their terms, meaning not just accepting a potential investor coming to talk to them about something, but defining in advance. And I think this is where the development partners, including the UN, have a very important role to play, helping them to define the types of projects that they feel will have the most impact for them and which are aligned with their development needs. So, for example, a lot of the demand in least developed countries is around sustainable agriculture because we're looking for domestic food production, as well as in many cases boosting, in some cases, agriculture for export. And we've seen some positive examples around sustainable production of cocoa, as an example, for the chocolate market. And you've got coffee as well along those lines. These projects have remained for the moment relatively small scale, but can be scaled up if governments, with the support of partners, can define the areas of interventions more clearly. Then the other big opportunity, I would say, is around energy. And we would like to see, because that really corresponds with, I think, a huge opportunity for the countries themselves, as well as potentially for partners. And Again, I think in existing projects, you have the good and the bad. And the way to focus on the better projects is to really ensure that there is a good preparation in advance and alignment with development priorities from a country perspective and not from an investor perspective.
What checks and balances can we put in place to ensure the overall effects are positive? How can we ensure that companies, for instance, comply and that these rules are actually enforced? Paul?
There is a vacuum of rules, regulations, regulatory frameworks, institutions who understand these things and actually do this. I have been to a number of LDCs where you have private sector who are engaged in that. And some people don't even know that their carbon credits are being sold out into the open market. So there is a lot that has to be done. And as Jean-Paul said, it's up to us, the international community and donors, to be able to provide that support and capacity building to help these governments build up their national institutions, their regulatory frameworks, help them have regional verification processes, help them to understand this, and help them to understand also the challenges of simply selling their carbon credits without really understanding what's going on. And this is a lot of work to be done.
Jean-Paul, what do you think the next big steps should be that need to happen? Because it does seem that we're really a long way from the ideal here, aren't we?
We are, but the way perhaps of looking at carbon markets is to see them as an accompanying financing mechanism for development, not as a goal in themselves. And I think Paul said it very well that carbon markets are not a silver bullet, but they can play a very important contribution alongside a lot of other sources of financing. Because, for example, if you want to transform your agricultural sector, which is a need in least developed countries, the majority of them are moving from very artisanal or livelihood-based agriculture done by individual families. And the goal is to move towards sustainable, more industrialized agriculture that can improve food production, can improve processes, but improve livelihoods as well. And also minimizing destructive impacts on the environment, such as deforestation. Then it makes sense to generate carbon markets as an additional benefit that again can be reinvested and provide additional flows of income for that country. I think among LDCs, there's a lot to be learned from one another. Looking at projects that have worked and those that have not. You don't want individual investors to go to different countries and saying, oh, well, we need a very flexible way of operating because if you don't, we'll go somewhere else. What you want is countries to say, this is the standard we have set. And then the capacity building aspect is going to be important at the national level for the regulation. There is a need globally for better regulation as well, because currently, essentially, we have kept the certification in the private sector. There's nothing wrong with that, but it does mean that the cost can sometimes be high, the cost of certification. There has also been recently some challenges to those certification methods by the private sector. And we need richer countries that have more experience in carbon markets to also be putting in more stringent standards on the certification process, but which recognize the development imperative in developing countries.
Paul, what role then does the private sector, developed countries, as well as developing countries and multilateral organizations have to support LDCs in making the most of carbon trading?
First of all, it's transparency. I think at the same time, there must be collaboration between governments and the private sector to be able to come up with these regulatory frameworks that make sense for them as well, not just the private sector. So they also understand opportunities and they have a source of information to be able to practice and to be able to buy carbon credits. As Jean-Paul says, we don't want a race to the bottom, we want a race to the top. Organizations like ours, private member states, and also donors have to help these countries to be able to benefit from this strategically, to be able to achieve their development aspirations.
Thank you to our two guests, UN Trade and Development's Paul Akiwumi and Jean-Paul Adam from the UN Office of the Special Advisor on Africa. Tune into the weekly Tradecast next week and every week for more insights on the most pressing issues around the world of trade and development. And there's even more on our website, UNCTAD.org. I'm Sarah Toms in Geneva. Goodbye for now.